Many developing economies depend on uncertain sources of financing to fund post-disaster recovery and reconstruction needs. Due to the lack of pre-arranged finances, disasters can disrupt economies and the fiscal balance of governments. This session will thus explore ways in which adopting disaster risk finance solutions can increase the financial resilience of public finance management systems. I would like to welcome and introduce the moderator for this session, Mr. Gaurav Chaudhary. Mr. Chaudhary has been a professional journalist for more than 27 years and has worked in leading media houses in leadership positions. He served as Deputy Executive Director of Network 18, moneycontrol.com, and can be seen regularly on television discussions on policy and the economy. Mr. Chaudhary remains engaged with Network 18 as a group consulting editor, and at present, he is the co-founder and editor at Earshot Media. I would like to welcome him onto the dais for commencing this session. Over to you, Mr. Chaudhary.
Thank you so much. It's after a sumptuous lunch, I would assume that it's again about time to bring back disaster and risk finance back into mainstream. A very good afternoon and a very warm welcome to all of you. We gather here at a time, there cannot be a better time to talk about this topic particularly because the visuals of the submerged airport in Dubai and various other parts in the neighborhood of Dubai are still very fresh in our minds. We have seen the fury and devastation of what rains and floods can cause in our own country. Every year we see that, both in mountains as well as in plains. And that is why, the focus on infrastructure, the criticality of infrastructure and making disaster resilient, climate resilient infrastructure is so essential, particularly for India because infrastructure remains the strongest vehicle to unleash economic multipliers. And we have seen that how the government over the last several years have really been focused on spending a lot of public money, budgeted money on creating physical infrastructure because the economic multipliers that infrastructure unleashes, it spins jobs, multiplies income, and also unleashes secondary round effects in the private sector by crowding in private sector investment. And that is why it is so important. That said, the conventional strands of thought and practice in public finance management now has come to be tested because what we have seen recently in the Gulf region and also in various parts of India across the last several years, how we need to create climate resilient infrastructure. And mainstreaming disaster risk finance in public finance management, which is the topic of this session, is something that a stellar panel of experts are going to talk about today. People who know this like the back of their palms. And there are various aspects to it. Of course, there's the question of the criticality of infrastructure. There's the risk to island economies, the evolution of new disaster risk management, financing innovations and instruments, and the role that the private sector can play, among others. It's my honor and privilege to welcome the speakers and experts for this session. Dr. Charlotte Benson, may I request you to come on stage, please. Dr. Charlotte Benson, independent consultant in disaster risk management. She is an independent consultant with more than 30 years of experience in disaster risk management across various developing countries. With a vast experience, her vast experience includes expertise in economic analysis of the impact of disasters, disaster risk reduction, disaster risk financing, and the integration of disaster risk management into development policy, among others. May I now invite Jill Bolland, Principal Natural Hazard and Climate Risk Consultant, Tonkin + Taylor. Jill Bolland is the Principal Risk Consultant at Tonkin & Taylor, New Zealand. She has over 15 years of experience in using advanced statistics and machine learning to model events and their impacts. She's an expert in spatial analysis, particularly in real time and historical analysis of satellite imagery. May I now invite Alexander Chavarro, founder Climate Finance 2050 Limited. Mr. Chavarro is a UK-based finance professional delivering solutions to the challenges posed by climate change mitigation and adaptation, biodiversity preservation, and sustainable development. He has 30 years of experience and counting, advising clients on project and corporate acquisitions, risk assessments, investments, and financing in energy infrastructure and maritime sectors, among others. May I invite Mr. Izoa Talemaibua, Permanent Secretary from the Ministry of Rural and Maritime Development and Disaster Management, Fiji. Mr. Talemaibua is the Permanent Secretary at the Ministry of Rural and Maritime Development and Disaster Management, Fiji. He earlier has served as the Head of Budget at the Ministry of Finance, Fiji. He's worked in various private sector organizations before being recruited as an Economic Planning Officer at the Budget Division in 2009. Mr. Sumit Gupta, Senior Client Manager, PSS India, Vice President, Public Sector Solutions, Swiss Re. Mr. Gupta is part of the Public Sector Solutions Group at Swiss Re India. He works largely with federal and state governments to help design and implement schemes in the areas of disaster risk transfer and management, aiming towards the reduction of existing protection gap. And finally, we have Professor Ilan Noy, who is joining us virtually, who is a chair in the Economics of Disasters and Climate Change School of Economics and Finance, Victoria, University of Wellington. Professor Ilan is the chair in the Economics of Disasters and Climate Change, Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand, and professor of economics at Gran Sasso Science Institute. His research and teaching focus on the economic aspects of natural hazards, disasters, and climate change and related topics. Thank you so much to all our expert panelists and distinguished speakers who have joined us today. It's searingly hot outside. It's very cool here. Everything has got to do with climate, of course. 20 years ago, it was not so hot in the month of April in Delhi. Now it's getting hotter and hotter every day. Yesterday, we saw how an unseasonal, unexpected storm actually brought down the temperatures and the cool respite was really welcome, but it's again back very, very hot again. I'll just set the house rules for this session. It'll be about 1 hour, 1.5 hours, about 90 minutes or so. We'll have a section where audience will be asking questions. So we'll try and keep that to about 15 to 20 minutes or so. But before that, we'll have a very engaging, compelling conversation here on stage with all our distinguished panelists on various levels of expertise and specialization that they have. We'll start this session with a context-setting presentation where Ms. Jill Boland will make a presentation for this, and it's going to set the context on national and state-level assessment of fiscal risks due to disaster in critical infrastructure sectors. The study is being conducted by ICDRI, ADPSE, and TNT. Ms. Jill Boland, please.
Right, kia ora everybody. I'm from New Zealand, that's our national greeting, and thank you very much for inviting me to this conference and to speak on this super important topic. So yeah, I'm here to introduce the combined project that we have going with CDRI, ADPC and my company Tonkin & Taylor, which is on the fiscal risks due to disaster in critical infrastructure sectors. Right, we've been hearing this morning, and we all know disasters, they cost. They cost lives, they cost local businesses, and they cost governments. There's direct costs with damage to infrastructure, but there's also those economic and indirect costs too. And those indirect costs, they can have huge impacts. They can potentially impact credit ratings of governments, and that can have ongoing implications for debt financing and other things. This is a slide that just introduces our project. Sorry, I'll stand here and you can see. So we're basically trying to do mostly the direct losses for different sectors and infrastructure, but we're also looking at those indirect and those economic losses. All right, so we all know they cost, but we don't really know how much they cost. So I've just put a little slide here to give you an idea of, we've got losses that maybe only happen once every 1 year, once every 5 years. I think we've got quite a good understanding of what those costs. And then we might have disasters that might happen every 20 years or so and ongoing. And I think a 20-year event, we have got, quite a good idea as well. But once we start to get to those 100-year losses or 500-year losses, the 2004 Boxing Day tsunami, that's maybe between 500 to 1,000-year event. I don't think we even know now how much that cost us. So there's big implications. If we need to do financial risk assessments, do financial risk financing, we need to understand what they actually cost us. So I'll just go back, sorry. So our project, what we're going to do, we're going to develop a robust methodology that local governments can use to understand this risk. We want to build local government capacity for risk analysis so that they can make risk-informed decisions. They can be having these conversations with international agencies and cat bonds and things like that with the understanding already about what these disasters will cost them. So then when they can make decisions based on that understanding. And they also can understand how much savings we can make by investing in that resilient infrastructure. As we heard this morning, what was it, $1 spent is $12 saved. But unless we know how much these cost, we can't do that return on investment or that cost-benefit analysis. So we're working with local governments very closely to try and get that data. That's another thing we've heard over and over again. We need data. We need data at a local level. We need household level data. We need data from local businesses and things like that. So we're working with governments. We're also looking at the MDATE, which is the International Disaster Database. This gives you an idea of the number of disasters per year in India since 1990. And of course, we have ICDRI. And we have disaster from local governments. This is from the Central Water Commission for India, and they have really good data. So we've managed to get some of that data as well. And we also have the ICDRI curves. So we're going to use all of this information to try and come to a good methodology and a good way for governments to try and understand these fiscal implications of disasters. So the first thing we did is we looked at the ICDRI curves. They're on a national level. And these are the ICDRI curves here for India for infrastructure, for I think there's roading, rail, and power infrastructure up there. And we've got, as I said, they've got the different hazards, storm surge, wind, and flooding. So first thing we did was we fitted these curves to an extreme distribution curve. And we used the Pareto curve, which is pretty much the curve that a lot of the insurance risk analysis will use. It's an extreme value curve that has a nice long fat tail. So we can use that tail to try and give it as an understanding of those 1 in 100 and beyond risks. This is just a slide showing you why don't we just use local data. And as you can see here for Odisha, we looked at all the cyclones. The super cycle has probably got a 1 in 50-year return period. And that was the biggest cyclone we could sort of find in the history that we had data for. Obviously, there's cyclones that happened before that, but we don't really know. We don't have much data for that. So we can't just rely on past events or information on events that happened recently. So what we need to do really is use a statistical curve to try and get those, the fiscal implications for data beyond 50-year events. So this is when we fitted the ICDRI curve to our Pareto, here we used some Monte Carlo simulation techniques. So with Monte Carlo simulation, you basically say, just simulate tens and thousands of events. And then you can use all of those events and turn it into a curve, and then you can start reading off your average annual loss, your 1 in 20 year loss, your 1 in 50 year loss, and these real tail losses that you can see there. So we've got those, we fitted those, and then we use the ICDRI data to try and fit the ICDRI curve to the local level. So we had data on those last cyclones that you saw, so we used that, put that into the mix, and then we can sort of almost like trying to downscale these risk curves. And as I said, we want a robust methodology, and we're sort of we want to discuss this with everybody about the best way to do this. But we want a nice, robust methodology that governments can follow, and that way they can use these ICDRI curves at the local level, not just at the national level. And then, so that's the catastrophe modelling part, but we also have an economic modelling part, because sometimes the economic losses are higher than the direct losses with really big events. So we do the economic modelling. It just shows you how it feeds in. So you have the disaster loss, and then you come through, and then the government provides relief, and the government does the recovery and reconstruction. But that impacts their budget, that impacts their debt levels, that can impact the interest rates that they get charged for debt. All of these things sort of flow through into the economic and the fiscal implications. But they're really hard to measure, these things. You know, we've been trying to measure them for quite a lot of time now, for many years, but they're very hard to measure. And again, we're not saying this is the best way, but we want a robust way that people can understand and implement themselves. Okay, so this is the data we're using for the economic modelling. All of our fiscal variables have come from the Reserve Bank of India. Thank you for the Reserve Bank of India, because that has some really nice data sets in there. We've got all that data, got it at the state level, and we've adjusted it all so that it's on today's basis. We also have these disaster intensity variables, and this is the idea of how much monetary damage was caused as a percentage of GDP. Again, normalised by CPI. We want to state everything as a percentage of GDP, so then they can be, then we can use this for future analysis as well. There's also the life years lost, which Elan, who's going to be on the panel later, had a lot of put a lot of work into. And the idea of the life years lost is that it gives us an idea of the number of people affected, as well as the number of lives, as well as the financial damage as well. So it tries to give you an overall damage impact. So this is just some initial results, and I can show you. So we're doing a bit of a panel model. And the idea of a panel model is that we use all the states as sort of controls. So what we can see, we've got the data from before a disaster. So we've got the Reserve Bank data going back to 1990 up until 2019. I think we decided to leave the COVID years out for economic analysis. And then what you do is, if you have the data before and after an event, and you have all the state data, then you sort of use those states as a bit of a control. So all the other things that are going on, like things that happen in the global economy, currency fluctuations, anything like that, that's sort of a bit controlled by all the other states that are involved. But we can tease out some of the results for the impact of disasters. So this is ICDRI again, and you can see here, this is just relief on account of natural calamities, and we've expressed that as a percentage of state GDP. So you can see that just went straight up after the super cyclone, and you can see we've just put a few other states on there for you to see, but you can see they didn't have that impact. So that's how we're going to try and tease out that information. And I think I might have gone so fast that I've used up all the time. So putting it all together, if we have an idea of this total risk, total monetary losses, including both direct and indirect losses, then we can start making these risk-informed decisions that everyone's been talking about today. If we can understand that fiscal implications, then we can understand what that actual mitigation the financial benefit of mitigation and resilience building is. Okay, at the moment, like we discussed this morning, this is seen as a cost for most people. You know, people don't really like building codes and spending extra money and doing all of that, or building seawalls or whatever that mitigation is. But we can actually maybe try and tease out how much money that will save if we do that. And then we can do a proper cost-benefit analysis. And as we've been seeing, we'll see that the right thing to do is spend the money now. You can also, the governments can also, when they talk to international insurers or reinsurers, you know, when they're looking at catastrophe bonds and things like that, at least they've got some risk-informed way that now they can start looking, this is the premium that I'm going to pay for my catastrophe bond. How much money will that save me potentially? Is that premium a good premium? Am I getting a good benefit out of that? And it can help secure the government's debt position. If we understand how much these events are going to cost us, then we can save up for them. We can put money aside. We can make sure it doesn't make the country go broke, or it doesn't change their financial or their international debt implications, which obviously, like I said, goes around to currency implications, debt financing, and all of that. So that's my very quick introduction on this model. And as I said, we want to be able to, we've got all of these global models, but a lot of them on that national level. Like we've got data. Data is always aggregated up to either a state or a national level or something like that. How can we start using this and apply it to the local, make it useful for people and for local governments to start using it in their budgetary analysis? Thank you.
Thank you, Jill. Thank you, Jill Boland, for this very insightful context-setting presentation on how to assess fiscal risks and due to that's caused by disasters and the impact that it plays out on critical infrastructure. So one interesting piece of statistic that you gave out was that we clearly know that how the periodicity or the frequency with which natural hazards, the severity, and also calamities take place. In the case of cyclones, for instance, in the case of Orisha, the super cyclone takes place more or less, if you go by past trends, about 50 years. And it ranges from 50 years to 4 years. We know that natural calamities of the serious nature actually takes place perhaps once in 200 years, and of a less severe nature, perhaps once in 200 years, once in 20 years. And in some cases, you know, natural events take place almost every year. From a public finance management perspective, if this data is so, we know it at such a granular level, why is it so difficult to anticipate from a public finance management point of view? Jill Boland?
I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer that. I think, you know, we always hope disasters won't happen, I think, and we have to understand that they will happen. They will happen every year. But it's hard to see the benefit of putting some money aside and not spending it. I mean, there's so much we have to spend money on. We have to be, you know, investing in health, investing in the social. We have to invest in people, invest in infrastructure. So there's so many demands, I suppose, on that small budget that each government has. And if you can't actually see the financial benefit of keeping some money aside for those, then it's hard to justify it. But if we can make that benefit more open and even publish things like that and let people know, then I think that would be more likely to.
Absolutely. Professor Ilan Noy, if I may pose this question the same question to you, and the kind of data that Jill Boland has put out, you know, we now know with a great degree of accuracy on how the extent to which natural disasters or the frequency with which natural disasters will take place will come about. Say, for instance, a calamity of a serious nature will come out only once in 200 years. But there are certain natural events that probably will take place every year, like a flood. For instance, in India, we have the annual monsoon that actually, you know, it devastates states every year. And more or less in different years, different states are devastated. From an innovative risk financing point of view, what is it something that you would recommend that we need to look at, which we are probably not looking at now? Professor Noy?
Yeah, first of all, I would wear my teacher hat for a moment and say that we misunderstand the issue of frequency of disasters. When we say that a disaster is a 1 in a 20-year event, we mean that specific event has a 5% probability. So we could plausibly have that same 1 in a 20-year event happen 3 years in a row, every year, consecutively. And a lot of people and a lot of policymakers do not understand that. We had an instance in New Zealand recently after the last year's big floods that we had in January 2023, when we found out, we got the transcripts of one of the local government's meetings in which the mayor of the city said, well, we had a 1 in a 100-year event 2 years ago, so we have 98 years in which we don't need to worry about it. And that's actually not what we mean by 1 in a 100 years. We actually just mean that there's a 1% chance every year that we get that event. So policymakers misunderstand what we mean by frequency of disasters. The frequency is also changing, and it's changing much more rapidly than we anticipated. We, meaning the climate scientists who work on this issue, and we see that you gave the example of heat waves in India, in which not only we have them more frequent and more early in the season, they're also stronger. So we now have potentially events with 50 degrees measured and so forth. So the risk is changing quite rapidly, and we are not anticipating that. We also need to be very careful when we define what we mean by 1 in a 100-year or 1 in 200-year, because the scale of the definition of the event is really important. So if you have 10 big river systems in India, and a 1 in a 10-year flood will happen every year in one of them, because there's a 10% flood chance in 10 places. So on average, one will happen every year. So we need to be really careful in how we define these things. And I think a lot of the reason we underinvest is because we don't understand these issues. We don't understand what we mean by 1 in a 100 years. We don't understand the definition of what we are evaluating, and we don't understand that the risk is changing very rapidly. I will finish at this point because
But,
as a teacher, I can continue forever.
Yeah, absolutely. But Professor Noy, in the context of what you said and Jill Boland's insights and data, how do you know how much financing is required to address disaster risk? And that's, if you know that, it's almost like cracking the Da Vinci Code. For a public finance professional or policymakers, they're every year they are almost caught unawares, and you can't blame them because this is something that you cannot anticipate. Now, so far as assessment of the risks is concerned, how do we go about actually cracking that code? And what is something that we are not doing that we should be doing?
Yeah, the Da Vinci Code is complicated, while this is not rocket science. It's a matter of collecting the data and analyzing the data with the existing tools that we have, and we have quite good existing tools. So insurance companies, for example, because that's their business, risk, evaluating risk, have developed over the last 30, 40 years quite sophisticated tools to evaluate risk. It doesn't look at everything, so it doesn't look at people, it looks at assets. And that's part of the life years index that Jill mentioned. The aim there is to think more about people rather than assets. But we do have the tools. A lot of times what we're missing is the data. It's a bit ridiculous to think in 2024 where there's so much data around, and so much of our data we give freely to private companies through our devices, that we still in this space exist in a data scarce environment. And that's largely a failure of governance rather than a failure of data collection. So there is a lot of data, but we don't get access to it, both data that collected, for example, by private entities like insurers, and data collected by governments. It's not available enough so that we can actually do these assessments. But the science of doing these assessments, or the economics modeling that is required to do this assessment, is actually not rocket science. I'm afraid to say, even though I would like to pretend I'm a rocket scientist.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's more about data gaps and also about using the right kind of data and collating and analyzing the right kind of data to arrive at the right assessment. You know, Mr. Alexander Shavra, I'll come to you later, but on this particular aspect, on assessing from the risks of natural disasters or natural events that continue to actually result in all kinds of policy shocks, particularly in a country like India where we have all climate systems present. What do you think that policymakers in a country like India should be doing to come at more accurate and precise assessments?
Well, I think as we just heard, a lot of it is about analyzing the data, using it, and ensuring that it's transparently and accessible. Because from that, then the financial markets will be able, including the insurance markets, will be able to price the risk. And at the end of the day, I think if we can collectively ensure that risks, investments, and pricing are all interrelated, that will get capital to start flowing more effectively and more just in terms of quantum. And at the moment, it's that mismatch between risks, availability of data, and pricing, which, to my mind, is one of the barriers to mobilizing finance.
Absolutely. Mr. Isowa Talemaibua, we are also surrounded by a lot of island nations, Sri Lanka being the closest to us, and we saw what kind of devastation and loss to lives and livelihoods natural disasters can bring about in the instance of tsunami, and those are still really fresh in our minds. The island economies face a particular peculiar situation. The ecosystems, their economics actually are driven by a completely different set of conditions, which we in different nations will not be able to understand or relate to. So their risks are very different from ours. We will not be able to perceive those. In your view, and since you have been at the forefront of policy making right there, how can risk finance instruments support small and developing nations, particularly island nations that face such high risks?
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. You said it right, the vulnerabilities of small island development states, the risks are very high as compared to the global south. But having said that, it is important for policymakers in the region to collectively design systems and processes that can reduce the vulnerabilities of the people. For example, getting the insurers to bid for policies for government infrastructures is very hard in the Pacific, because one, we lack most of the Pacific Island countries lack the recording system. Infrastructures are not recorded. For example, the day the bridge was built, the total cost, all these informations, most Pacific Island countries like Fiji don't have those information on hand. So in order for the insurers to come in and buy and take up the policy, these are all the organized events that we need to do. But with the support of key development partners like these coalitions that can drive this process to the island nations so that we can take care of all our infrastructures in the island nations and get it insured. Other than that, we cannot go through it because different countries, different island nations, we have different risks altogether. And the risk we face are so high that we are just relying on proper policy, on proper situational proper situational advice that will help us go through these disasters.
Absolutely. Professor Ilan Noy, if I may bring you in here, Mr. Talemaibua has pointed out that it's also a question of information asymmetry so far as island nations are concerned, because the vulnerabilities of the island nations are unique, not just because they are islands, but also unique to each island nation. Whereas policies are framed and risk finances instruments are developed and have evolved, not keeping in mind the vulnerabilities because they seem, of the island nations because they seem to be in a minority in terms of numbers, and the collective might of the non-island nations, actually the data collected from the non-island nations seems to dominate policy making and also have led to evolution of financing instruments, which kind of does not address the specific risks that the island nations face. What would you like to say to that? Professor Noy.
I would actually bounce back the question to Charlie Benson, who is on stage, because she's worked at the Asian Development Bank for a long time. And the Asian Development Bank has actually been quite central in supporting the Pacific Island nations in terms of disaster risk financing, especially contingency grants programs, and a program that I think was mistailored to the Pacific. And in that sense, I agree with the previous speaker. The sovereign insurance program called PCRAFI that was instituted and largely failed in the Pacific. So I definitely agree that sometimes we seem to have a one-size-fits-all approach, which doesn't suit the small island nations. But also I would argue that there is a lot of attempts, especially, for example, by the Asian Development Bank and other institutions, multilateral institutions, to support small island nations.
Absolutely. Charlie Benson, would you like to respond to what Professor Noy said?
Is that on? Yeah, that's on, yeah. Well, I don't work for the Asian Development Bank anymore, so I shouldn't really speak on their behalf. But, I mean, certainly ADB has provided, in particular, a lot of contingent financing to the Pacific. So that is financing through projects that are pre-agreed before a disaster occurs. They come with policy actions to strengthen the underlying resilience, which is a huge benefit because it's not just addressing the need for financing after the impact of a disaster, but also to help minimize the resulting impact when an event actually occurs. But contingent financing is just one of a portfolio of instruments that governments should ideally be looking at, focusing both on risk retention, which would include contingent financing. It keeps the risk still on government books, national disaster funds and so on, and then the risk transfer instruments as well. And so in the context of the Pacific, there is the regional risk pool, which has been going for a number of years with some success.
Absolutely. You know, Mr. Alexander Chavarro, how can public policies support the development and, you know, the evolution of innovative risk finance instruments?
Thank you, Gaurav. This is quite an important and large topic. If you allow me, I would like to also extend it to the mobilization of finance for adaptation and resilience. And I'll start by mentioning a couple of words that I don't think we've heard so far today, which is market failure. We heard this morning the notion of reorienting the hands of the market, but I actually think that in relation to disaster risk and adaptation and resilience financing, there is a case for market failure. And that is largely summed up by the word, the time value of money, which is that if you invest today so that you improve the value and the resilience of your asset in the future, lower any damages, well, that quantification of potential loss in the future in present value terms is going to be, in most instances, lower than what you would need to invest today. Therefore, the investments don't happen. So that, in my mind, at least coming at it from the private sector point of view, is where a market failure stands. And therefore, it calls for public policy action. I'd like to start by mentioning 4 types of innovative financial instruments when we talk about finance in the climate context. And then I'll cover where I think public policy can have an impact. And thirdly, I'll finish with what I think the outcomes are to measure the success of such public policies. The 4 innovative financial instruments I see are, firstly, to some of you it may sound as a surprise, but perhaps not from a public policy standpoint, is taxes, right? Oftentimes, when you read and hear about public policy and climate finance, it starts with new taxes. Actually, I will refer you to an interview that the recent Economics Nobel Prize Esther Duflo gave to the FT earlier this week about what she calls climate-focused tax proposals. So this is innovative in some ways. I'm not sure it's necessarily finance. But the second one is really, and the core of it is blended finance. And that's about mobilizing public and private capital to help de-risk and indeed reduce the cost of the blended capital. I think we heard a bit about this morning. That is a critical element. The third is, and you mentioned that, Charlotte, is around risk transfer mechanisms and the use of insurance products. And indeed combining insurance with finance, which in my view, and that of many in the insurance market, is, I think, a way forward. And the last but not least, you also now hear and see instruments which link the cost of capital to specific outcomes and specific targets. So I think it was mentioned again, the notion of sustainability-linked loans or bonds, and that is very much innovative, and that indeed perhaps could be used more in the future for adaptation, resilience, and indeed DR. So these various areas, to my mind, refer to what Kamal Kishore mentioned this morning as better designed money. And so it's a question of, how do we do it and how do we push it out in the market? Now, how can the public policy and governments help do that? I think there are three ways they can do that. One is by creating incentives. It could be tax credits, it could be other policy signals, price signals, but it's again going back to my earlier point about ensuring that the cost of finance reflects the risks that it helps reduce. The second is a series of enabling of regulations. I think standards, particularly in the built environment, is very important, and the dissemination of these standards across the globe. Second, taxonomies. I would refer you to the work that, for example, the Climate Bonds Initiative is currently doing on the development of a resilience taxonomy, which would help eventually channel capital towards resilience. And third is about risk assessments and reporting. And again, we heard a bit about this morning. ICDRI is indeed one of the tools, but ensuring that such assessments are required by providers of capital, I think is important. Third, in terms of public policy areas, I would mention the allocation of capital. After all, governments have money that they can allocate. I think they should do that parsimoniously, and they should do that where it matters. One way of doing it, and this is one of the recommendations of the ICDRI Global Resilience Report that was issued in October last year, is through the creation of national resilience funds, which could perhaps both help channel the capital and provide the incentives to monetize the benefits of resilience. The second, in terms of capital allocation, is in relation to contingent capital for disaster risk, for example, and the pooling mechanism, which I'm sure our colleagues from Swiss Free here will touch on. So to my mind, these are the three areas. Now, to finish, how do we measure successful outcomes here? And the first one is through the implementation of disaster risk and resilience assessment tools and methodologies, and ensuring that all the actors do that. One tool I would mention is the one that was developed by the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment a couple of years ago. It's so-called Physical Climate Risk Assessment Methodology, which indeed, as was again discussed earlier today, looks at the various interdisciplinary aspects of climate data, engineering, economics and finance to look at risk assessment. The second, in terms of outcomes, is ensuring that we can quantify disaster risk and resilience benefits. Because it's one thing to assess it, but if we can't quantify it, then again, we can't link it to pricing. And that's the role of data. And then last but not least is to implement mechanisms to monetize and allocate these benefits. And it's allocated to specific assets, but also to network of assets, and more largely to communities.
Right. You touched upon a lot of points, but specifically on the allocation of capital, for instance, are you recommending that within the federal and the state budgets, the governments actually set aside progressively more and more for disaster risk financing of infrastructure, or do you think more capital being allocated for infrastructure financing itself will do it? Ms. Allen.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily oppose the two. I mean, in some ways, if you have capital allocated for disaster risk, it will help, capital to flow into resilient infrastructure. It's a question of who should provide what capital for what. I think it's also, to me, there's three parties here. There's governments and what contingent capital they should provide. There's private sector providers of capital to fund these assets. And then there's the insurance community to, in some ways, absorb tail risks. And so it's defining the right balance between the three, which I think is critical.
Absolutely. Sumit Gupta, we previously talked about here only a couple of minutes ago on the gaps that exist on data, and also the right kind of data and the evidence that the private sector is collecting not being probably appropriately used for optimal benefits and results and outcomes. Now, in your view, how can private sector disaster risk assessment capabilities actually come in and play a big role?
Thanks, Gaurav. See, I would like to, this is one of the topics which are, kind of discussed in all the forums nowadays. And, being an reinsurer, I would, rather start by mentioning that, we comes where the risk transfer happens, right? And we would like to talk about the entire scheme of things on the risk transfer piece. Because it is largely driven by insurance and a reinsurance solutions, which helps the government in reducing their protection gap. Now, if you see in the insurance industry, there are two instruments through which the risk transfers can happen. One is through the reinsurance arrangement, and the other one is through the issuance of the cat bond. Now, if you want to structure the entire risk transfer, you have further two options. It can happen by way of indemnity-based product, which is if the event happens, you've got to deploy a lot of loss adjusters, people there in the ground to assess the loss. It takes time, but ultimately when the loss is assessed, the basis risk is less, you're able to pay the claim. The other part is by way of pre-agreed triggers, wherein the entire parametric insurance cover comes into picture. So when we say pre-agreed, the entire role of large granular data and the technology comes into picture. And we've had some success in one of the states in Nagaland where we designed the entire product for the state for the excess rainfall. It is gaining the popularity. Parametric product is gaining the popularity because of further two reasons, because it is easy to structure, because the product is designed through the data. And the best part is we have seen whichever nation has adopted parametric product, the claims have been paid within 30 days of the event happening for the relief and the recovery and the reconstruction of the public assets. Now, another role where I see the reinsurance can play, or it can be, as an enabler to create the infrastructure resilience, and I'll pick it up from where Rowan Douglas left in the morning, and I would like to exemplify that. He said that no insurance, no financing, which is right. But at the same time, you've got to have innovative tools to finance or support the multilateral departments also. And I can take an example of Nepal. So what has happened in 2015, Nepal was, we kind of prepared a innovative parametric product for their hydroelectric power dams. In 2015, Nepal was jolted by a massive earthquake with a Richter scale of about 7.8 magnitude. It was one of the hydropower project which had the largest funding from FDI and which could boost the renewable power production in the country. But when this massive earthquake jolted the nation, a lot of traditional insurers withdrew their capacity. They said that we are not going to insure it anymore because there was damage in the plant, there was damage in the site, and all of those things. We were approached. We designed a parametric product specifically for that plant. And we said that we will not insure the plant, let the traditional insurer do the or provide the capacity for other risks. We are going to insure that particular site for the earthquake peril. We prepared a program with the help of USGS, which is United States Geological Survey data, which measures the intensity of the particular earthquake during that site. We brought it to multi-development bank. We convinced them. We convinced the local regulator. We convinced the local cedent. And this is a classic case of public-private partnership where we came out with innovative parametric solutions, and the multilateral development bank was ready then to finance it. So what I'm trying to tell you is, it is not just the insurance, where the risk transfer lies. Now within the insurance, you have to come up with the innovative products which addresses the need of the investors.
Right. So because when you speak to a public policy maker here, particularly in South Asia, in Nepal and also in India, and also if you speak to infrastructure project developers, the general impression you get is that achieving financial closure is a challenge because insurers are not willing to underwrite it. Now, either they're looking at it, it could also well be a communication problem, or both the project developer and the insurer and the reinsurer will have to meet midway for this to be solved. You cannot have a one-size-fits-all and what you have been doing for the last 50 years to approach the same problem all over again. Now, do you think it's actually a challenge? What is your own experience saying in terms of achieving financial closure? Is insurance underwriting of the projects by insurers a challenge which is real and that needs to be tackled?
See, it could be. I mean, when I mentioned Nepal, it was a classic case because as a nation, it is earthquake prone. But we believe in Swiss Re that we can prepare a solution for any such risk, and we have done that. And that's where the innovation of the product lies, and that's where the role of data, the role of technology comes into the picture.
Right. Charlotte Benson, one of the questions that keep on coming up is that there are various challenges that the governments also face in setting aside adequate or providing adequate finance for disaster risk management. What, in your views, are those challenges specifically governments face for this, and how can we address that? Because it's not just about devising a policy; it's also about ensuring adequate finance. And budgets, central budgets, or federal budgets, or state budgets are always limited because there's only that much you can spend, and you cannot go on printing money and doing helicopter drop of money and trying to ensure adequate financing.
Thank you. And thank you also for this opportunity to speak, thanks to CDRI. So the gaps themselves, I think we've already covered them. They're pretty obvious from a financial perspective. They're very tight government budgets, particularly in this post-COVID era. Another immediately more pressing demands on government finance, particularly to show achievements within an electoral cycle. And there are also very limited opportunities still at the end of the day for income-generating, bankable investments in disaster risk reduction, in turn impacting the extent of private finance and the scope for public-private partnerships in that space. The good news is that there are a number of measures to address these challenges, both in investing in risk reduction and in finding adequate financing after an event to address the fact that currently reconstruction, recovery is really prolonged and often corners are cut because of lack of financing to really build back better. So we're reconstructing the old issues. So some of those solutions, measures are really exciting. There's been a lot of innovation recently around, as we've just heard, parametric insurance, cat bonds, disaster resilience impact bonds, hopefully coming soon. In India, huge advances in agricultural insurance, drawing in fintech solutions, satellite-based technology, and so on. And we're seeing some really exciting stuff to help get money moving very quickly after a disaster. I want to just focus, if I may, on some of the more mundane solutions, particularly from a government perspective, to get money in both to risk reduction and response. So there's 6 particular solutions or measures I want to touch on. The first is dedicated funding. This has already come up. Should we not have money earmarked for resilience? So the common approach really over the last few decades has been to absorb disaster resilience costs within broader investment budgets, and that's been referred to as mainstreaming disaster risk reduction into development. It's based on really sound logic. If, say, you're building a new road, ideally what you do is you take a disaster risk assessment at a very early stage to inform that project design, and in turn you put in wider drainage systems, steeper camber on the road, slope stabilization works, whatever is required to address the disaster risk that you've identified. Now, the challenge is, even if you've got that far, you then find that your budget is rather tight, so you don't necessarily follow through on those measures, and they don't actually happen. And I think we've really got to the point where we just have to accept that mainstreaming alone is not sufficient. We do need dedicated ring-fenced resources for investment in disaster risk reduction. We need matching funds, conditional funds, special grants, to also enable communities, local government, line agencies to access those additional resources that they need to make a difference and really build resilience. Also in those formulas for distributing national government resources across local government, we should be introducing weights taking account of the relative disaster risk faced by different parts of a country. If you live in an area of really high risk, then perhaps you need additional government resources allocated to you because you need to build your infrastructure to higher standards. The second point I wanted to make was costed disaster risk reduction plans. Many governments have disaster risk reduction plans, but not so many of them attach a price to those. So you don't know how much money is needed to actually implement the plan, nor where that money needs to sit. We need to move beyond that, not least to force some more realistic ambition and prioritization into those plans, and better still link those costed plans to costed adaptation plans to exploit potential synergies between the two, and also help open the door to accessing climate funds, national and global, for disaster risk management purposes. My third suggestion would be to strengthen the links between disaster risk management policies and budgets. So using common technical language. I don't know how many of you have sat down with a disaster risk management policy on one side, the annual budget on the other, and tried to understand how the policy is going to be implemented through a new plan. It's very difficult because the language is so different. So we need to address that gap. We need to tag and track expenditure on disaster risk reduction, preparedness, relief, early recovery, reconstruction. So we've heard a little bit already today about cost-benefit ratios, the fact that you can save very significant money by investing ahead of time in resilience rather than waiting until an event happens and reconstructing. Unfortunately, still, there is very little hard cost-benefit analysis out there, particularly when you drill down to an individual country and an individual sector. There's not that site-specific information you need. We need to build that bank of evidence to really tackle that. And at the same time, sorry, I've drifted in my thoughts here. So that is around building evidence, which actually was a separate point I was going to make, but I've kind of drifted into that. I also wanted to say, going back to tagging and tracking, that we, anecdotal evidence suggests we're spending way more in response than we do on risk reduction. And we also need to tackle that. Part of the issue there is it's actually hard to get the numbers. We don't quite know how much we actually really do spend on risk reduction, nor quite how much we spend after a disaster. We know they need those figures to point out that imbalance and to push the money across to risk reduction rather than those very lumpy, very enormous amounts of spending on response. And then my final point, turning to the residual risk, the need for financing for post-disaster response. So coming back to some of the conversation we've already had, we need to establish financing strategies ahead of time and related action plans. Those financial strategies need to be based on those disaster risk assessments, on contingent liabilities, and then build a series of risk retention and risk transfer instruments to address the identified risks. And those action plans, those strategies should focus not just on the instruments to raise the money themselves, but on all the peripheral things that need to happen to ensure that when a disaster happens, not only does the money flow in, but there are the budgetary processes, the procurement processes, and so on, that enable the fast-tracked utilization of that money. I'll stop there. Thank you.
And so, do you think that actually for governments, disaster risk finance and disaster risk policy from a public policy point of view, it's still not accorded the highest priority that government should be according? Do you think it's a question of lower prioritization also at this point?
Yeah, disaster risk financing strategies are surprisingly new. 10 years ago, we weren't really talking about them very much. We were aware we needed them, just as we need ex-ante recovery plans, ex-ante reconstruction plans. But it was generally more of an approach of wait and see, and then we'll find the money or we won't,
right,
as is the case.
Absolutely. Now, Professor Illinois, if I may toss that question to you, do you think that governments, regardless of the fact that every government almost is a public policy maker, particularly in countries like India and large parts of Asia, face the challenge of devising the right policy mix to deal with disaster risk finance and disaster risk assessment for critical infrastructure? It's not being talked about in the same manner that it should be because it's not been given a higher priority that it deserves. Do you think that is where a part of the problem is?
Yes, so, I fully agree with 2 points that Charlie made. One is that there isn't enough spending on risk reduction and much more on response and recovery. With risk reduction, we need to distinguish between spending, making sure that when we are building new infrastructure, we are building it to standards that make it resilient. When we have existing infrastructure, we maintain it so that the standards of resilience do not deteriorate over time. And in some cases, when we have existing infrastructure that is risky, we retrofit it so it becomes less risky. These two latter issues, maintaining infrastructure and retrofitting infrastructure to increase resilience, to be quite blunt, they don't have votes in them. So the political system doesn't support that kind of investment. And even the building of a new infrastructure to make it resilient, a lot of times it's only adding maybe 5% of the cost or even less than that to make it resilient. But that last 5% has very little visibility. So it's very difficult to convince the political system to support that kind of spending. I also want to talk briefly about the sort of the post-event financing needs. I am a bit worried that when we are talking about, for example, parametric infrastructure, we are pursuing innovation for innovation's sake, and not because that innovation is actually productive in the sense that it reduces risk. I think the example, if I may, and I think every panel needs to have a little bit of disagreement, otherwise it's not fun. The example of the Nepal hydropower dam is actually an example where you actually don't need parametric insurance. So the failure there was private insurers were not willing to insure. So as I understand, Swiss Re developed a parametric product, And then the multilateral development banks backed it up. So it's still the private insurers were not involved, even once the parametric product was involved. So in a sense, there was a problem. The solution didn't really solve the problem. It just transferred the risk to a different entity, which is the multilateral development banks. The multilateral development banks could have anyway covered the dam without the parametric insurance product, just by a contingency program that says if there is damage to the dam because of an earthquake, we will cover the costs. Okay, the risk with the parametric tool is that the parametric model is not perfectly aligned with the actual damage that dam will suffer. So in a sense, what the multilateral development bank was buying is a bit of a lottery ticket on whether that will actually pay for damages if the dam is damaged. And so it doesn't really solve the issue of the risk for the dam, and it's unnecessary because it doesn't really create any involvement of the private sector. So I think that is true for a lot of the parametric tools. Actually, I agree with Charlie that the problems we face are much more basic, and these are basically the reasons we're not solving those basic problems are failures of politics and governance, rather than we don't have tools that are sophisticated enough to deal with them.
Do you like to respond to that, or do you agree to disagree?
Well, I would obviously not agree to that, because that was one of the innovations which has happened in the industry, and obviously there are critics to it. But I would say, to answer him, we were not covering the hydropower dam. We were not covering the project per se. What we were covering was the peril. And that's what the consortium of 8 multi-development bank wanted. They wanted some kind of collateral to move forward to refinance the plant where the damages happened. So that was an innovation. Now, when I say the parametric, it could solve a lot of other problems. So, as we say that in Swiss Re we are also climate resilience. In the previous session, when Kathy was mentioning about covering the female workers who go out in the field to work, we were the one who were insuring them. We created a heat index product, at least for the first time for Swiss Re, wherein we covered about 50,000 female workers who are working out there in the field, in the construction sector, in the salt factories. And if the temperature goes up to a beyond threshold, we are covering the loss of wages. So that's the power of parametric product which comes into picture.
Absolutely right. Mr. Isova Talamaiboa, we heard Charlie Benson talk about the issues about the adequacy of public finance management so far as disaster risk is concerned. My question to you is the one that I raised before is, and since you have been a long-standing policymaker, do you think it is not accorded the priority that it deserves, disaster risk in public policy management?
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I may say that there are enough considerations given to disaster risk financing, but the problem for island states that we are so small, our budget too is small. So to invest in a resilient infrastructure, it may delay the necessary funding of other infrastructures along the island nations. So for example, in Fiji, we are invested in upgrading tar sealing, resealing of a road just within the suburb, which costs us 65 million. But that 65 million in the name of resilience. But we could have used that 65 million in upgrading the other rural roads that can help everybody along the island nations. But having said that, we, in the allied nations, we must have the political will to get that portion of funding reserved for disaster preparedness and responses. Because the size of the pie is so small, we have competing priorities. We don't have that appetite to allocate, certain funding to support disasters. So that's the chaos for us.
Absolutely. Jill Boland, it's also finally a question of risk assessment capabilities. And what are the risk assessment capabilities, in your view, that government should actually embrace and start investing and acquiring for better disaster risk finance management?
So when you talk about risk, we talk about hazard, vulnerability or resilience, as we call it now, and exposure. And I feel we know a lot about the hazards now. There's been a lot of modelling on hazards. We understand, cyclones and frequency, maybe not frequency as well as we should, as Elan said. But we've got a really good understanding of those underlying hazards. What we don't understand is those vulnerabilities, and we don't really understand the exposure as much. In richer countries, which most countries have, those countries, like my country, every house in New Zealand is pretty much insured. So we have exposure data because of the insurance, basically, that we've got that. So I think that's something where governments need to start understanding that risk on that really local level. What is the vulnerability at that local level? What is this exposure? And again, we've talked before about assets. Exposure, we always think of them in terms of assets, and that's really important. But we should be also thinking about social exposure. What's the social vulnerability to those disasters, as well as the physical vulnerability to disasters? So I think governments can help by, one, collecting that data and making sure that data is theirs to make those decisions, but also starting to have more idea of what those social impacts, the economic impacts are, as well as just what the impact on assets is as well, which has been sort of the traditional way of doing it.
Absolutely. We'll now throw it open for questions. We have about 10 minutes or so. If there are any questions, you can raise your hand, identify yourself, and also be specific about who the question is actually addressed to, the speaker. There's one question right in the front row.
Good afternoon. Yes, good afternoon. I'm Safir Rizvi, advisor, NDMA. So my question is to the controversy in the room, Professor Noy and Sumit Gupta. So Professor Noy has told us that parametric insurance is not a good idea, and maybe the multilaterals who bought the so-called insurance in Nepal were actually buying a lottery ticket, or rather selling a lottery ticket. And Mr. Sumit Gupta has told us that parametric insurance is a brand new product. The insurance industry is very happy with it. So I am sharing my experience at NDMA that in this country today, we have many states and union territories which have issues with regard to several hazards. They have tried to look for insurance, but only one state, Nagaland, has managed to come out with has managed to buy a parametric insurance cover. They've been happy with their experience, so they have now come out with another bid in which they want somebody to come and bid and design a product for them. So my question is that in a large country, large multi-hazard country, why hasn't the private insurers or the reinsurers come up with a standard disaster risk insurance product based on parametrics for extreme precipitation? Why does the government of India, why do the states have to ask for a bid to come and design a product for them? Why doesn't it already exist?
Absolutely. Sumit, I think you are the best position to address that. Is there a design flaw? Is there something that needs to be addressed there?
Thanks, Mr. Ridvi. See, parametric product is not new in India. It was first launched in year 2007-2008. And under the crop insurance, we have a separate category with the name of WBCIS, which state government comes out with their term sheet. They design the parametric, and insurance and reinsurance companies bids. So it's not that the extreme precipitation is not being developed by the reinsurance company. It's being developed. It's for a certain segment of people, which is the farmers. Now, if the state government or the federal government wants us to work towards designing a particular product, we would recommend starting with a very simple product of excess rainfall, experiment it, and probably launch it to a different state government level, because pooling too many perils in single product may create a confusion from the end user's mind and in terms of understanding the product also. We can obviously come and prepare a product along with the state government or a federal government if we have nth number of years of data available with us as well.
But the question is, why can't a standard designed parametric product be
You
ready?
cannot have standard for every state, because every state have a different geography altogether. So, and it doesn't make sense for having a standard product, because if you are going to have a standard product, some would benefit, some would not benefit. So my suggestion would be, let's zone it in a manner where, say, suppose eastern side of we develop a set of parameters, western side we develop a standard parameter. I can give you an example. For example, Mexico has a very good national disaster risk management program where they combined, where they take reinsurance and a catastrophe bond also altogether. So with respect to the reinsurance, what they have done, they have secured themselves by taking the private sector help, and the normal losses of infrastructure damages and all, they put it under the reinsurance, and the cat losses they put it under, and there are two cat losses which they probably take it for. One is the TC, which is the tropical cyclone. The other one is the earthquake. So that's where they have kind of devised and directed.
Absolutely. Jill Boland, you wanted to make a point?
Can I make a point as well?
Yeah,
on this?
Professor. Yeah.
Well, I was just going to talk a little bit in favour of parametric insurance. I do believe there's a lot of issues with it, and it has to be designed at the local level, and you have to do it local exposure, local vulnerability. But when I was working with Aon, we worked very closely with the Indian government to set up the Prime Minister's crop insurance scheme, which is a parametric insurance scheme, and it's been going for like more than 30 years. So maybe India almost invented parametric insurance, and it has been going really well, but it has to be tailored to that local and vulnerability level. So it does work sometimes.
Professor Noy, you wanted to make a point?
Yes, so my objection is not to parametric insurance per se. Parametric insurance indeed was probably invented in India and a few other places almost 20 years ago, and it was specifically geared to individual farmers. So because it overcomes a major issue, and that is indemnity insurance is very expensive to assess at the very local level for micro insurance. So these are insurance for very small amounts, say $100, $200 that farmers need in order to cover crop losses. So for that, parametric is excellent. It's an excellent solution to the fact that indemnity insurance is very expensive for micro insurance. It is, in my view, a complete failure if you want to do it as a macro insurance for Nagaland or for even bigger entities like India or Mexico. It's unnecessary. It introduces basis risk, so the possibility that actually you have damages and you won't be covered by the product, but for no reason, because the issue with big insurance products like for Nagaland that Nagaland bought is not the expense of assessing the damages. That's not the issue that you need to overcome. So in a sense, it's solving a problem that doesn't exist at the cost of introducing this randomness in payments. So in this sense, I think it's a mistake for the government of India and for the colleague here from the NDMA to argue that we need a state level parametric cover. Yes, state level, we might need state level insurance, although maybe the central government can provide that at a cheaper cost than the private sector. But there's no reason for that product to be parametric. It will unnecessarily insert this basis risk at no benefit.
There's a question. Fourth, fifth row. Yeah, two questions.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity. I am a professor in Bangladesh University of Engineering Technology, doing research for the last 20 years on adaptation, risk reduction, etc. in the deltaic region. So our understanding is, it's not exactly the question, it's a kind of compliment. When we think about the risk, it's a hazard, vulnerability, exposure, adaptive capacity. So it is connected within the system. For example, when we are trying to reduce risk, enhance resilience, at some point, the risk is transferred to the other region. So the point that has not been discussed in this forum that I identified is, we need to assess these things at the system level, dynamically, changes with time, irrespective of adaptation or not, because of the natural processes and also because of the human interventions. So these are the issues we need to, otherwise many adaptations will be the maladaptations in the future that we need to assess. Thank you very much.
Right, it's more of an observation than a question, that we need to assess the risks at the system level rather. Anyone, Jill Bolin, would you like to add to that? Yeah, there's a question in the row there. One behind you. That.
Thank you for this opportunity. Actually, currently I'm doing some research on hydropower. So I have two questions based on that. So since disasters happening continuously, and there is also rising trends of insurance premiums. So how public financial institutions or government take into consideration of increasing premiums from the insurance side? And my second question is, so is there any threshold beyond which insurers will consider hydropower risk to be uninsurable, like given the rising frequency of natural disasters?
Sumit, I think you are the most...
See, hydropower is one of the risks which you will not find a lot of capacities in the reinsurance and the insurance market because of its risk per se, because it's like 0-1 game. You would have seen last year what has happened in Sikkim Teesta. The entire plant got washed away and there was a loss of, optically there was a loss of about 15,000 crores. And now the market is quite hardened. Now when we say the market is hardened, any hydropower plant companies, you know, the rate would become higher, it will increase because of the risk itself. So there is no benchmark per se where, you know, you say that we are going to increase the premium, but the assessment is done on the basis of the risk, which is assessed internally, and hydropower comes at the top level that way.
Thank you. Last question, please. Yeah.
I'm Colonel Sanjay Srivastav. I lead an organization, CROPSI, and I'm a professor of practice in Terry School of Advanced Studies. I am one of the think tank behind the insurance which Nagaland has done. The parametric analysis of Nagaland for 12 locations with 10 parameters with data from 1979 to 2021 is so strong that risk identification and corresponding resilience building has been planned in the entire financial risk transfer mechanism. And it is most important that when you design such product, the data is most important, which serves you entire financial strength. So it is very important that the available data should be utilized. Not only this event, but there are products for seasonal events in India where very good parametric insurances have been planned. And the revenue load from the government is passed to the community and the other agencies. And there is a community ownership, especially the big events, like we have cricket matches, we have the big fairs, you know, Kumbh and all, where the risk transfer is being done on the parametric basis. So this is a submission, especially to Professor Noy, just for information. Thank you.
That's right. It kind of reinforces the point that Sumit has been trying to make. Thank you so much. Thank you so.
Can I
Yeah, Professor
respond?
Noy, last word to you.
First of all, I'm very, very happy that the Nagaland product was very well calibrated. I hope that the experience in the years to come will indeed show when events actually happen and that insurance actually needs to pay, that the calibration will prove to be successful, and indeed the payment will be allocated, and there won't be any instances in which it's not. We know, for example, from the Pacific, and my colleague here from Fiji can probably confirm that in several instances there were big events in the Pacific where the governments, and I'm thinking here of specifically of Vanuatu and the Solomon Islands, both thought that they will be paid by the parametric cover that they bought, but they were not paid because the trigger was actually not triggered, even though the event caused a lot of damage. So I sincerely hope that this is not the case in Nagaland, and I trust the questionnaire that this is indeed the case. I want to say something about the hydro insurance question. We know from the experience in high-income countries that private insurers are not willing to cover natural hazard risk, especially extreme natural hazard risk. And that's why we have government intervention all over the place, in all of these markets everywhere around the world. So this is true in the US with the National Flood Insurance Program. It's true in my own country, in New Zealand, with the Earthquake Commission. It's true in Japan. It's true in California. It's true in Europe. All countries in Europe insure their natural hazard risk through the government. So the private, if we are trying to look for the private sector as the solution in this case of hydropower in India, we're not going to get there. There needs to be government intervention to provide that cover if the government decides that this hydropower is indeed the right investment. And then the government needs to cover this risk, because otherwise it's not going to be covered sufficiently and cheaply enough.
To have this conversation with us. Thank you.